Welcome to the 2010 MNN Producers Candidate Forum, a community service to help you, the viewer, decide among all the great candidates who are running for office here in New York City. Today we are joined by Mr. Vincent Morgan, a graduate of both Howard University and Columbia University School of Public Affairs, a community development banker here in New York City, as well as a husband and father of 2 babies. Welcome, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your campaign and what the voters need to know about you.
Well, I'm Vince Morgan. I'm running for Congress in the 15th Congressional District of New York, and that is Upper Manhattan above 96th Street and a few other areas, a small portion of Queens and a very small portion of the Bronx. It's time. I decided to run a few years ago and have been looking at when my opportunity would present itself. And I think that this is a prime opportunity to really put a new face on the leadership in Upper Manhattan and what we need to do as a community to move our collective goals and our collective ambitions forward. Having an opportunity to run for Congress is a very rare opportunity. Most people, if they looked around at the congressional seats in New York, you know, most of the representatives have been there for well over 10 years, in most instances over 15, 20 years. So this is a pretty rare occurrence when we have a race where we're going to have a serious challenge to an incumbent. In 2001, I actually worked for the man I decided to run against, and I'm hoping to succeed in his office, doing constituent work. And really, my call to public service started out, you know, working in that busy congressional office and dealing with some of the day-to-day issues of the people of the district. So it's ironic now, having such a wonderful experience there, that I'm actually running against a man, and I want to sort of carry on some of the things that he's done in a good way. But I certainly think that there's some things that he has sort of fallen down on, and we need to sort of turn the page and move in a different direction and build on those positive things in a more modern, a more comprehensive way for the district.
So tell us some of the people who've influenced you the most, both in politics and out of politics.
My inspiration is coming from the people that I'm meeting with day to day. I was on 125th Street petitioning on Tuesday of this week, and a little old woman, her name was Bernice Johnson, stops. She's in a wheelchair. She says she was 85 years old, and she grilled me harder than anyone else would. She literally flipped her wheelchair around and sat there and said, if I'm going to sign your petition, you've got to answer some questions. And you know, that's my inspiration. I'm trying to bring leadership to the 15th Congressional District that it's in tune with the people here on the ground. And I'm just enjoying meeting with folks and talking to them about their issues. And I hope to be the representative that they can look at and say, he's always sort of here with us and hearing what we have to say. So my inspiration really comes from the people of the district. I worked on the Obama campaign early on, when people still questioned, who's this guy? You know, Barack Obama? You know, this is New York. I mean, Hillary Clinton is the person that we're going to support. I mean, are you kidding? Nobody will ever vote for a guy named Barack Obama for president. And, you know, look where we sit today. I think that there's a magic in opportunity, and a magic when people see that the opportunity is there to really do something different and positive. And we haven't seen the end of that story yet. But I just love how it started, because it got so many people inspired and involved in the process that haven't been involved in the process before. And they were really committed to sort of being out there and doing it for him.
Tell us about Harlem. What drew you there, and what keeps you there and makes you excited about running for Congress?
I've been in Harlem for the better part of 10 years, and I've lived and worked in Harlem for the better part of 10 years. There's something magical about Upper Manhattan and Harlem specifically. Harlem to me is everything now. I met my wife in Harlem. I actually have raising my family in Harlem, so it has become, you know, home for me. I moved to New York in 2000. I spent 3.5 years living and working in South Africa, and when I was on my way back to the United States, I decided that I was going to, you know, try something different. I actually moved to Harlem because my first month here, I stayed with a cousin of mine who had an apartment in Harlem. And it's just one of those things that you end up in where you're supposed to be.
As an American in 2010, how would you describe your identity?
I am African American, but I do feel a unique sense to the world. My wife is the product of immigrants. I mean, her mother is Canadian, and her mother's a naturalized citizen here, and her father, who got his citizenship probably 10 years ago, is from the West Indies. So we live in a very American but internationally influenced household because there's different perspectives of there. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, you know, so I actually identify with sort of the neighborhood that I grew up in, which, as I said before, is very similar to, you know, the neighborhood that I live in now in Harlem. Harlem was known for the Apollo Theater, and in Chicago, the neighborhood I grew up up a block away from the original site of the Regal Theater, which was Chicago's equivalent of the Apollo. So I am a big fan of sort of history and African-American history and all of the things that sort of make up, you know, Harlem and the great legacy that it has. So it's kind of cool to live in Harlem now because you sort of walk down Lenox Avenue or Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, 7th and 8th Avenues, and you know, you pass by these places that mean so much historically, and it's like, I'm here.
What are the critical issues for right now for the people of Harlem?
Affordable housing is always a major issue for people in New York. I mean, obviously, looking around New York City, in particular in Manhattan, it's getting harder and harder to find affordable housing. And as people get moved out of other areas in southern Manhattan, you know, we found that a lot of folks have moved into upper Manhattan and has displaced the people who were there before. You know, development doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It just has to be well thought out and planned out so that we can make sure that we protect, you know, working families that live here. I certainly do not want to live in a Manhattan where working families can't afford to live in any part of it anymore. And I think that Upper Manhattan is the last bastion where we're going to see examples of real everyday working people that can still, you know, be in this district. And I want to make sure that I provide the type of leadership that protects those people and their right to sort of be here, because, you know, it really is becoming the last bastion for just regular, ordinary folks to build a community.
When it comes to the next steps and the sort of next period of time for the 15th District, what kind of difference do you expect to make when elected to Congress? We're
at a point in, you know, my competitor's career where we need to start having the conversation about what comes next. We have a tendency to wait for the retirement ceremony or the memorial service before we start planning for what happens next. And there are critical issues that are happening right now in this district, and we're going to need to start developing that next generation of leadership that's going to be able to respond to the critical education need that we have in Upper Manhattan, and the critical housing need that we have in Upper Manhattan, and the critical small business support need that we have in Upper Manhattan. But specifically, we need a plan of action, and a plan of action that's going to be responsive to the people of the district, and that starts out with the data. I'm going to give you a statistic that's very alarming to me. We have a significant portion of the population of Upper Manhattan that doesn't have a high school diploma. You know, the 2008 census estimates that it's somewhere in the area of 100,000 people that don't have a high school diploma. And out of a population of 650,000 people, if you have a population over 25 that doesn't have a high school diploma in the tens of thousands, you know, we have to start there and figure out, one, who they are, where they are, and how we can provide them with assistance so that they can sort of move up the ladder and become gainfully employed.
Can you describe the Harlem you'd like to see in 5 and 10 years?
Harlem and Upper Manhattan have always been the most diverse part of Manhattan and a very diverse part of New York. And I just want to see that diversity, you know, be celebrated more, and for people to come together around common issues and common goals. Because I don't care whether you're in Washington Heights talking to the Dominican community up there or the Jewish community up there, or you're in East Harlem talking to Puerto Ricans or Mexican community, or if you're in Central Harlem talking to the African population, the Senegalese population on 116th Street. There are 3 things that are important to them: where they're going to live and how they afford it, where their kids are going to go to school, and how they're going to sustain themselves, having a quality job so that they can put food on the table. Those 3 issues are the same issues regardless of what your language is, regardless of where you came from. And I want to make sure that our district is a district where we always have examples of all of that diversity, and that everybody is able to sustain themselves and be a part of the community.
As we sit here in Manhattan Neighborhood Network's premier facility on 59th Street, this is a facility funded by the fact that New Yorkers allowed cable companies like Time Warner and RCN to dig up the streets to provide their for-profit service, but that community access is provided classes, access, the ability to submit a program as a public service. We already have that. There's been a plan for over 10 years to bring a satellite facility to Uptown. First, it was going to be 125th Street where Clinton's office was. Second, it was going to be a certain location in East Harlem.
Right.
This has not happened. And in the last 10 years, since Nina and I have been on the board here, and I think a lot of people are wondering, if the funds exist and the will exists, what could you and other elected officials do between, sort of re-upping our franchise agreement to, tax incentives? What can be done to finally bring this level of education, cameras, access, offline editing, online editing to Harlem as a resource for residents?
People forget, the airwaves are ours. The government licenses the airwaves to people, to broadcasters, to actually broadcast their for-profit, television shows. So it's critically important that we have, stations like MNN and what you do here, because their airwaves are ours. We're supposed to have some say in that. I would be 100% behind having a satellite office uptown, and I think that the technology as it exists and the access to that technology for people empowers them to express themselves. This candidate forum right here is an important thing and an important use of those resources, because it allows folks to identify and engage from themselves to people who are like them, which is very, very important. We just need to have more examples of that, and I think that Harlem would be a great place to have a satellite office, because it would allow real people to engage on real issues that impact, their neighbors and their community. I think location would be the thing, and we just need to stand up and find a proper location and get the resources to make that happen. And I'm sure that that our friends at the cable companies or whatever would be supportive of that if we actually got to work and figured it out. So I would call on all of the elected officials uptown to stand up and say we want to get this done, and start evaluating how it can be done, and figure out basically how to make it happen in a timely fashion.
We are 2 years into the expiration of the franchise agreement for Manhattan Neighborhood Network with RCN and with Time Warner. Furthermore, we used to have a program called the Community Media Grants, where we gave away between $1 and $2 million a year to support individual nonprofits like the ones you mentioned in the Bronx, like the ones that are throughout Manhattan, so that they could have equipment, cameras, and editing, as well as staff, to teach and empower their constituencies to make shows, higher quality shows than some other kinds of shows that go on MNN. But that program, it's my understanding, has been eliminated. Now again, we're not gaining ground. We're not building a satellite facility. We're not making those grants anymore. And we're losing ground. And now it's my understanding that the franchise agreement has not been, sort of continued. And I feel personally that there's some level of jeopardy, between FCC hearings that have gone on that, I don't know all the facts, but how could someone like yourself, once elected as congressman, help individual citizens and producers like myself sort of slice through all of the lack of information and red tape to make sure that this facility lives and gets as fully empowered as it can be for the citizens of New York? We need to protect our rights to express ourselves. And as technology increases, it's even more important for this type of broadcast mechanism to live, because there's so many other ways that you can distribute those broadcasts now. You can film it in the studio and then it goes viral, and you actually can reach a much wider audience for the whole thing. I think what we need, though, is we need champions on the ground who understand, and that's people on the street as well as our elected officials, that this is something that is our right, and it is something that we should protect, because it is our way to communicate with the wider world of folks. And
we all look at television and we all like pass by the MNN stations, and we actually always stop. I know, we always stop and say, yeah, that was pretty interesting. If we took it more seriously, it goes back to the conversation about voting, you know what I mean? We should just be a little bit less apathetic about it. We should invest more in these mechanisms that we have. And, you know, I believe in that process, and I want to be a champion for those types of things, those things that keep the balance between the everyday person on the street and the big business, the Comcast of the world, who actually, you know, show us a lot of shows that we like and a lot of sports programming that we like. But there has to always be that balance, because this is America, and this is a democracy, and we own the air rights, and you know, I can go down the list of the reasons why. But we need to engage more people to become involved in the process. And what I love about this is that you're engaging real people with real shows, and that empowers other people to say, that could be me, and I could have my own show if they brought it to me. So I'm going to be a champion, getting that station up, the satellite station uptown, and making sure that we have some good programming coming out of Upper Manhattan, so that we can inspire some more people to get out there on the streets with us and fight for more resources as we move forward.
What do you think are the critical interventions that you can make as a new congressman to improve Harlem residents' access to technology, both in terms of learning, internet, all the ways in which it can enhance their lives?
Well, I'm very supportive of the concept of some type of tax incentives for property owners who actually wire their buildings and provide, you know, internet service for residents. I mean, these are ideas where federal legislation could be impactful, especially in urban communities. I envision Upper Manhattan being sort of an urban model for best practices and ideas and concepts that sort of build community around things like technology and around things like workforce development. We should be a model that the rest of the country can replicate, because there are many districts around the country that suffer from the same problems, but everybody sort of looks to New York for our leadership, and I really think that Upper Manhattan could provide that type of leadership, especially with technology and making technology available to folks. Technology has become the thing where there's a big divide between the haves and the have-nots, and it's really based on cost and access to technology. I mean, it's great, you know, if you can afford to actually pay for broadband service, but if you can't, if you're struggling to feed your family, I mean, if you can't pay a $60 a month bill to pay for broadband, if we could figure out some type of way to provide some type of tax incentive to landlords to just provide the broadband service for the building in some poor areas, it would be at least the first step in making sure that folks can have access to this. And then there are great organizations that can provide the hardware. There's an organization out of the Bronx called Perscolis, which is a not-for-profit organization where they sell refurbished corporate computers that are donated to them, to people who fall in a certain income range for very, very discounted prices. So I'd like to use what we already have and focus resources into, you know, organizations like that to make sure that they have more resources to provide more computers to more people. Half the battle is not creating new stuff, it's just maximizing what you already have.
What other economic issues face the people of Harlem, and what are your ideas to solve those problems?
Well, you know, the other major economic issue that faces the people of Harlem is actually the small business community. You know, we are finding every year that goes by, we're seeing less and less indigenous businesses in Upper Manhattan. The Greater Harlem Chamber of Commerce actually released a statistic last year that was alarming, that during the economic downturn, over 40% of the small businesses sort of closed their doors because they couldn't survive the economic downturn, which is still here. You know, people talk about this recovery, but most of the folks I talk to and see every day, you know, haven't felt the recovery and are still very, very afraid about the direction that the economy is going in. And even though we see these bright spots, it hasn't necessarily reached down to a lot of people on the streets. We've got businesses where people come to Upper Manhattan to go to because they can't get those products or services anywhere else. And we need to maximize that and support these businesses, because once they're gone, they're gone.
As a sort of cultural center between the Apollo, different musicians, different music styles and dance and all sorts of things, how do you think elected officials can bring leadership and new ideas to how to exploit Harlem's assets as a sort of tourist draw?
Very good question. And, you know, that's the industry that we have in Upper Manhattan. I mean, we've got a great Dominican cultural center that's about to open in Washington Heights. That is a draw. The Cloisters in Inwood is a huge draw for European tourists. We need to make sure that the Apollo and the Cloisters and the Dominican Cultural Center and El Barrio are all these draws and these economic drivers for folks. The problem is that we need to make sure that once the tourists get there, they actually stay a while and they actually patronize the restaurants and the other establishments that offer, you know, services or offer other products that they can go, the novelty stuff that goes along with tourism.
As a community development banker and as a public servant, how best can you help Harlemites move into ownership, be that their own home, their own business, and the store on their block?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question, and that's really one of the things that I'm charged with in my role as a community development manager. Is figuring out how to actually best maximize the resources that the banks have, and it's one of the resources that we have is providing mortgages to people. But it's a two-way street. We need to start earlier in our lives and our careers with a very basic principle of saving. And savings is the thing that actually over time gets you to the point where you can, you know, buy your own home. So before anything else, you know, you need to start saving money. It helps your credit if you have a savings account. It actually helps you provide the actual down payment and the cushion that you need. And if we really sort of adopted a principle with our children of saving and building on that, I think we'd go a long way to making sure that we have a lot more people who ultimately are qualified for housing. So it's a two-way street. And then the banks, obviously, they need to continue to make an effort to make sure that they are actually reaching out to, you know, folks and providing them with the type of financial education that they need, and also the resources that they need to have access to, mortgage programs that they design and they develop for first-time home buyers.
What about the environment in, both in Harlem and more generally in New York City?
Upper Manhattan has one of the highest asthma rates in the country, not just in New York.
Right.
We have a lot of old building stock and a lot of outdated means to heat and cool buildings. So these buildings will have a heating and cooling plant in the building that's way outdated. In many instances is oil or coal heat. And we need to provide some type of incentive so that landlords actually just upgrade their heating and cooling plants. I also think that there's something to be said for development, new development that actually incorporates green technology, but all the old housing stock we're going to have to do something with, and we're going to have to figure out how to make it worthwhile for landlords to consider upgrading their heating and cooling facilities, incorporating things like solar paneling on their roofs, incorporating things that are more energy friendly and environmentally friendly, because they're not just going to do it on their own. They you know, most of this stuff, especially for old housing stock, is expensive, and you've got to give them some type of reason to want to do it. And I think it's worth investing in those types of things, and it's worth the federal government figuring out a way to incentivize in some type of manner the kickstart that's necessary to get more property owners to take advantage of that.
How do you balance the demands of the large employers of the district, for instance, Columbia University and City University of New York, and Target, with the interests of working families and of small businesses?
Most of the larger employers, if you really broke down the statistics of where their workers come from, I'm sure you'd find a large percentage of the population of their workforce doesn't even come from Upper Manhattan. So the equation for me is always, of course, I like to create more jobs. The Upper Manhattan 15th Congressional District has one of the highest unemployment rates and concentrations of unemployment in certain parts of the district that are 2 to 3 times what they are in the rest of New York. And it's been that way for 40 years. There has been no progress or change when it comes to unemployment. And what we need to do is figure out how to get people better employed so that they can work anywhere. Of course, we want to create jobs in the 15th Congressional District, but most of us don't work where we actually live. I'd prefer to see people who are qualified and who are able to work so they can get a job wherever they want to go, so they're not sort of trapped where they be. Now, if that is new jobs that we're creating uptown, great. But I'd like to see more people employable so that we can actually do that. I'd also like to see more people who are skilled, qualified, who live in the district, who can apply and qualify for jobs in some of these larger employers that are uptown. And that's the balance that we need to find. We need to take that population of underemployed or unemployed people in Upper Manhattan and provide them with some services that, that allow them to become employable. And that will help, I think, build a better community for everyone.
As a person of color and also a graduate of Columbia, I often have friends and neighbors in Harlem ask me, you know, how can Columbia University build into Harlem? How can Columbia University not regard the site that has historical significance because of the assassination of Malcolm X? How can we best balance the historical legacy and the cultural identity of Harlemites with the great things that Columbia brings to not only the academic community, but also to New York City?
Progress and development is going to happen. The issue, though, is how it happens and who's included in the process. And of course, we don't want to see development that sort of like tears down or diminishes or doesn't take into account, you know, historic sites or the indigenous population or other things that are important to the community that they want to develop in. But at the same time, you know, the amount of jobs and the amount of development that actually goes on there could be beneficial. I mean, they're building a middle school, you know, as a part of this process to develop on the Upper West Side. So I think that you always have to have some type of balance, but it really becomes a question about community participation and how that process of how the development is going to take place and what it looks like happens. And I think that, you know, and we've had some news this week that Columbia's the original decision to provide for eminent domain for some properties that were in question was actually upheld by the Supreme Court of New York. That the project is going to move forward. You know, we understand that, but there's still an opportunity to make sure that Columbia does the right thing and develops in a right way so that more people are involved in the process. We can create some jobs for some people of Upper Manhattan. We don't, you know, do anything that damages sort of the cultural core and fiber. And I think that my leadership will provide a good conduit between Columbia University and the rest of the community to make sure that we keep them on point and we actually provide some opportunities